Yes, this is lecture number 3. Today we are going to talk about the Nixon administration. President Nixon was elected President of the United States of America in 1969, in January 1969. And, we remember that, the Americans were involved in Vietnam. It was a bloody war, massive casualties. Demonstrations were taking place throughout the United States of America, and people were opposed the Vietnam War. They wanted this war to come to an end. Nixon came with the realization that he has to stop this war that makes no sense. And that objective was what he had to work on. And at the time, his Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. Now, in order to achieve that objective, secret negotiations took place between the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese, and the United States of America, ultimately leading to an agreement, the Paris Agreement, the known Paris Agreement, where hostilities were ceased and the American forces were to leave Vietnam. And we remember very well that the scenes or the scene where American ships were evacuating American troops and staff from the embassy from Hanoi in Vietnam, and they were dumping the extra aircraft that there was no room for it into the sea. And we also remember that hundreds of Vietnamese people who were allies of the Americans wanted to seek refuge in the United States, and they all went to the American embassy seeking political asylum, but they were not accommodated. It was remarkable scene that history will not forget. So the Americans ultimately signed this peace treaty and the Paris Agreement, and the war in Vietnam has ended. American forces were withdrawn. But, the Nixon administration was really a significant administration in terms of the change in outlook towards peace in the world. Realization of Vietnam was an exercise in futility, but also the world was in a state of tension that is unparalleled, that they had to find ways and means between the Soviet Union and the United States to ease the tensions. And negotiations were being held between the Americans and the Soviets to come to some kind of an agreement regarding the massive number of strategic weapons that are being held by the two superpowers, that they can destroy this world of ours many times. And they could bring actually an end to all humanity in this world be because of the weapons and the stockpiles of weapons that have got not only warheads but multiple warheads that can go into different directions and strike different cities simultaneously at the same time, being carried by one missile. This state of madness had to be addressed. Ultimately, the Americans and the Soviets entered into something that is called SALT I, which is Strategic Arms Limitations number one, and then they have followed it up by another agreement called SALT II, where they have agreed to limit the number of missiles and warheads each superpower holds to a limited number, and they had to destroy whatever excess of missiles and weapons that the superpowers held as a result of this struggle and armed struggle that is between the two countries, or the arms race is the proper term for it. This has led to, the easement of tensions between the two superpowers, a term that is referred to in the language of political science as détente. Détente became what characterizes the relations between the Soviet Union and the United States in order to bring about some sense and stability, lessening the reliance on the policy of massive assured destruction. But also, President Nixon realized that it's not only the Americans and the Russians, but there are the Americans and the Chinese. Relations between the two were not really good. There were no relations between China, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and the Americans. So Nixon wanted to open channels of dialogue and communication, and that was achieved by holding tournaments, sports tournaments, particularly ping pong between the Americans and the Chinese. It became known as the ping pong diplomacy. It was actually those games that took place that opened an opportunity for President Nixon to visit China in 1972 and to achieve full normalization of relations between the two countries and full diplomatic relations. Very significant and important major step in foreign policy and a change in the direction of this hostility that has characterized our world from 1944 until 1972. But then again, his unfortunate luck that President Nixon got involved into what is known as the Watergate scandal. This Watergate scandal is actually a scandal that was uncovered during the recent elections of 1972 because Nixon was president and was re-elected in 1972. And, the media has found out that some of the Republican Party members of the Nixon Party went into the Democratic Party's headquarters, known as the Watergate Building, which is a building that still stands in Washington, D.C. It is right there in Washington, the District of Columbia, and the Watergate Building sits next to the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., close to the White House, close to the Pentagon, close to the State Department, and what was revealed is that some of President Nixon's members of staff during the election period, they broke into the headquarters of the Democratic Party and they got some information from the computers of the Democratic Party, and this led to a scandal. And ultimately, the U.S. Congress held investigations and hearings regarding this act, illegal act, which is against federal law. It is a federal crime. And so, in reality, Nixon from 1972 until his resignation in 1974 was a term they use in the United States of America, a sitting duck. In other words, he was being investigated. He could do very little. He was, in a sense, spending all of his time defending his case against this impeachment that hearings that were being held in the U.S. Congress, and ultimately he had to surrender and provide the U.S. Congress with the tapes and all the information that was required out of him. He handed over to the Congress, and definitely all the information pointed out to the Republican Party being responsible, and particularly the president. So he was on his way of being impeached, but he decided to go ahead and resign. What is so significant about this period is that between the year of 1972 until 1974, when President Nixon resigned, his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State, and by de facto, since Kissinger, since Nixon, sorry, since Nixon was paralyzed, the ultimate decision maker when it came to foreign policy was Henry Kissinger. He was the head of the State Department, and it is referred to as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in so many countries. And this is really critical because, when he was really running foreign policy, he was in charge of foreign policy, Henry Kissinger, we had important and significant events take place in the world. And, if we, study some of the literature and the books that Henry Kissinger wrote, he is a man that believed into the issue of balance of power, the use of power to compel other actors to do what they would not otherwise do. So, through the use of power, a very much rational person, rational analysis, realist school of thought. And this rational analysis, realist school of thought, was really significant because it maintained this struggle between East and West. And where was this most significant was in 1973 during the Ramadan War, the October War. Excuse me. I'll come back to you.